Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome to this Peak Prosperity Podcast. I am your host, Chris Martenson, and today I am really excited to introduce a man who needs no introduction. Richard Heinberg, author, educator, speaker, writer now of 11 books, including Party's Over, the one that got me started on the peak oil story, The End of Growth, and Snake Oil, How Fracking's False Promise of Plenty Imperils Our Future.
Try saying that fast 5 times.
I did, and that's the best I could do. Welcome, Richard.
Good to be with you, Chris.
So I want to start here. The Party's Over, the
Yeah.
book that did get me started on peak oil, written in 2003.
Yeah.
And very clearly articulated, oil is a finite substance, and we've built this whole giant growing economic model around it, and that's a problem. It's a predicament. Here we are 11 years later in 2014, and the party is still continuing.
Right.
What's going on?
Well, I recently went back and reread the first edition of Party's Over because it was the 10th year anniversary. And I was actually a little surprised to see what it really says.
Mm-hmm.
My forecasts in the Party's Over were really based on the work of 2 veteran petroleum geologists, Colin Campbell and Jean Lahuerre. So they were saying back before 2003, because it was published in 2003, so it was actually written in 2001 to 2002. So they were saying back in 2000, 2001 that we would see a peak in conventional oil around 2005, check.
Mm-hmm.
That would cause oil prices to bump higher,
Mm-hmm.
check, which would cause a slowdown in economic growth, check, but would also incentivize production of unconventional oil in various forms, check, which would then peak around 2015, which is basically almost where we are right now, and all of the signs are suggesting that is going to be a check-off too. So amazingly enough, these 2 guys got it perfectly correct 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an amazing part of the story is that at a price, there's always more oil.
Right.
If it was $1 trillion a drop, I assume we'd find ways to actually flip North Dakota over and scrape the source rock out. And so the price and availability and supply of oil is always a big deal. I see that a lot when people are talking about the resources of natural gas that exist, but fail to tell me at what price those exist, right? To get the resource is always possible, but the price is important. And yet we look at the economic sphere and we discover that the economy also has a price for oil, but it's what it can afford to pay.
That's exactly right.
And as I look across the last 3 years, we've roughly been averaging $100 a barrel on the international landscape. And what do we see? We see Ukraine suddenly dissolving. We see Southern Europe with 50% unemployment rates, all things that I think were predicted by almost anybody who was really looking at the peak oil story a long time ago. It's all really coming true, and yet the story today is not really connecting those 2 pieces together, except for people like you and myself and a number of others, but really a handful.
Right. Yeah. The big news right now is that the industry needs prices higher than the economy will allow, as you were just outlining. And so we're seeing the major oil companies cutting back on capital expenditure in upstream projects, which will undoubtedly have an impact a year or 2 down the line in terms of lower oil production. That's why I think that Campbell and Lahuerre were right on in saying 2015, 2016 maybe, we'll also start to see the rapid increase in production from the Bakken and the Eagle Ford here in the U.S. start to flatten out, and probably within a year or 2 after that, we'll see the commencement of a rapid decline. So, on a net basis, taking all those things into account, I think we're probably pretty likely to see global oil production start to head south in the next year or 2. But this change in capital expenditure by the majors, that's a new story. Just a couple of years ago, they needed oil prices around $100 a barrel in order to justify upstream investments. But that's no longer true. Now they need something like $120 a barrel, but the economy can't stand prices that high. So if the price starts to go up a little bit, then demand just falls back. People start driving less. And so the economy is unable to deliver oil prices to the industry that the industry needs. This is I think Gail Tverberg is saying this is the beginning of the end. Yeah, I think she's right.
Well, this part about the oil majors, I really want to harp on this because it's really, to me, this is a smoking gun. The oil majors are not in the business of supplying us oil. They're in the business of making money.
Right.
And they've been extraordinarily good at it. And they're businesses. And very intelligent people. I know a lot of people who work at Shell and Exxon. They're really hardworking. And they've scoured the globe. They've looked at all their possible opportunities. And they've come to the conclusion that the extent to which they spend money on CapEx is the extent to which they're going to hurt cash flows and the potential for shareholder value and dividend payments. So they've decided to cut back on CapEx, capital expenditures, meaning exploring for new finds, infill drilling in existing places, all the places, that upstream word you mentioned, that's creating more supply. They all have now, I think we're on the 5th year of declining output from the 7 oil majors. These are the big ones: Total, Exxon, Shell, BP, etc. And they've been spending, I think they've doubled their CapEx in the last 5 years, and their collective output is down at least 10 or 12%. So they're spending more, getting less, and they've just thrown in the towel this year and said, until and unless oil prices are higher than they currently are, we can't invest in this game anymore. How is that not front page news with congressional committees being formed immediately in urgent haste?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, this is extraordinarily important news, and we're just not hearing it really. I mean, the occasional article in Wall Street Journal, but this is going to impact our entire way of life. Another way of looking at this is declining energy return on energy investment. We've been talking about declining financial returns on investment in the oil industry, and that's, as you say, that's huge news. But just as big a news is declining energy returns. High energy returns on energy investment is what made the Industrial Revolution happen. It's what made the middle class. It's what made urbanization and all the rest. But the industry's having to invest not just more money, but also more energy in producing unconventional oil and gas. So this means that more labor and more real investment of materials as well as money has to go into the energy production business all the time. Now, if we go all the way back to the average energy profits of agrarian times, which were maybe 3 or 4, 5 to 1, something like that, basically virtually 3/4 of the population would have to be involved in producing energy in order to produce enough surplus for the other 25% to live in towns and specialize in, being bankers or mayors or whatever else, stamp collectors, who knows. But, that's the path we're on. I read an article the other day talking about solar energy and how it produces more jobs than the oil industry and the coal industry combined. But what the article didn't say is that, yes, and solar provides only a tiny proportion of the energy to society as coal and oil combined. So, yeah, we want more jobs. That's a good thing. But look at where this is headed. If this trend continues, then at some point, basically, there's not going to be enough surplus to fund all the things that we're used to, like education, healthcare,
retirement.
Yeah, right, on and on.
Speaking on solar for a second, whenever I give a talk, inevitably the hand goes up and says, "But what about this alternative future?"
Right.
Amory Lovins, we're all going to have carbon fiber cars, and we're going to have this solar future. And for a while there, I had a hard time getting the energy return on energy invested data out of what solar really was. I sort of have this 20 to 30 to 1 thing waving around on a graph, but that was industry supplied data. And so the only real data I've seen so far is Charlie Hall and another gentleman whose name...
Pedro Prieto.
Yes, they took a look at the Spanish return. So Spain has built... has enough experience, and they've built both a aggregated solar tower collector with all the mirrors pointing at a central device, plus they have lots of installed base. And they came up with some interesting results, didn't they, when they looked at the energy return?
Yeah, they came up with, I think, 5 to 1 or less as an energy return. And just so folks understand, a 5 to 1 return on investment would be great in the financial world, but in the energy world, everything we do requires energy. Whether again it's healthcare, or education, or manufacturing, all of those things use energy, but they don't produce any energy. So that the little bit of energy that we invest in getting more energy has to be extraordinarily productive. Historically, it was in the range of 100 to 1 with oil and coal and the early industrial revolution. Now in the U.S., it's down to about 10 to 1. So it's questionable whether we can continue to operate a complex industrial society on energy profit ratios of less than 10 to 1. So if solar really is 5 to 1, that's problematic. Now, my friend Chris Nelder would probably be sitting here arguing with us that in fact solar is much better than that. And I'm not an engineer myself. I haven't done the calculations, so I don't know. But I think there is good reason to assume that renewable energy sources, intermittent energy sources like solar and wind, can give us better energy returns than were common during the agrarian era, but they're not going to be able to power the way of life we've gotten used to with cheap, portable, on-demand energy from oil and other fossil fuels.
Well, my perception, and perhaps this is wrong, but when I look back and when people were in agrarian societies, I see those as times when people's work life was rather expansive. The farming life is not easy. Anybody listening to this who is a farmer knows that, and I've hung out with lots of farmers. It's a pretty full-time commitment. When the growing season is up, you're working hard. And what I see today is that even on minimum wage, which I think is paltry, but even on minimum wage, your need to work, the number of hours you have to work in order to buy the number of calories you need to live for the day, is really still very modest by any agrarian standard whatsoever. And so that's what I think we're talking about here, is that we've got these very expansive lifestyles that have sort of pushed out into all these really creative ways of existing. And those just by necessity retract as the amount of surplus energy we have shrinks.
Yeah, and we're seeing that. Americans, even though the GDP is going up, for most Americans, their actual experience is that they're losing ground. That there are more jobs being created each month. We hear the statistics from the government, but they don't pay as much as the jobs that disappeared over the last few years. And so on average, people are finding that they're losing ground. And this is exactly what we would predict based on what we've been talking about with regard to the larger energy picture.
Oh, absolutely. So I want to finish out on the energy story before we move on to really the implications and I think socially, culturally, and psychologically of all of this, because you've got some fascinating things to say there. I got a quote I want you to build out on.
Yeah.
But first, let's really talk. So the shale miracle has really been pumped and hyped. And from my perspective, it's a lot of propaganda at this point in time, because what I see are pieces in the New York Times even, which look like PR collateral shipped out by Range Resources and copy-pasted into the article.
That's exactly what they are, probably.
I think that some of that is. So Range Resources being one of the premier North American operators in the shale play, not to pick on them personally. But something is really interesting going on there when we look at the Red Queen syndrome, which says you have to run really fast, and I think people are familiar with this now because the shale wells deplete so rapidly that when you're in a semi-mature play like the Barnett, soon to be the Bakken, you have to then put in 1,000, 1,500, maybe 2,000 wells per year just to maintain production, because behind you, your existing wells are falling off these cliffs. So you're running in place, just putting in these new high-producing but rapidly depleting wells. And in that story, somehow we're supposed to believe that this is our new energy future. But you said something really interesting earlier, which is that the Bakken is probably going to top out at some point in the not too distant future, a couple, 3 years away.
Yeah.
when did we first start drilling seriously in that? 2007?
Well, the Bakken has been producing for a long time with conventional wells, but in terms of horizontal hydrofractured wells, just in the last few years. I think 2007 is probably a good number.
So we're talking about supposedly one of the most productive, most amazing fields, and it's going to go from basically inception to peak in 10 years. That's a completely different profile from the Gawar, which is still, first tapped in 30s, I think, and really producing in the 50s, maybe?
Late 40s, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it didn't hit a peak of production for decades, many decades, and we'll have a long, gentle downslope of many, many decades.
Right, yeah. Well, that's the difference between a conventional oil well, where you have cap rock and highly porous rock holding the fuel, and what we're seeing here in the U.S. in these unconventional plays, which is, you used the term earlier, source rock. This is rock that's has very low permeability. Much of the oil is already migrated out of it into conventional reservoirs, or just migrated to the surface and volatilized probably millennia ago. And getting that oil out is technically possible, but it's really difficult. It doesn't want to move through the rock. It wants to stay right where it is. That's why they horizontally drill and hydrofracture it. But these are the last worst plays, onshore plays in North America, and geologists have known about them for decades and thought, we'll never be going after source rocks. But here we are. That's where we are. This is the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah, Arthur Berman put it beautifully in a presentation I saw where he said, "It's not a shale revolution, it's a retirement party." and I've held a piece of this so-called source rock in my hand, and I would not be disappointed to have this stuff as kitchen counter surface. It's not this open, wonderful, porous material that you could put your lips up to and suck something through. It's literally solid rock by my human interpretation of feeling it. A little greasy, but it's basically just really, really impenetrable stuff. And that's what we're going after. So between the oil majors saying we can't make money at 100 a barrel, we're slowing down or stopping or even reversing capex, and then the idea that we're drilling into things that take this extraordinary effort that are going to peak within maybe 10 to 15 years of their initial rapid, almost frantic production, and yet somehow through this story, most people I talk to have no concern whatsoever because that's what they've been told. We have our energy concerns are in the rearview mirror. We have 100 years of natural gas. We have all sorts of things that are just contextually and patently false, provably false.
Amazing public relations machine that the industry has trotted out. But they need that public relations in order to maintain the value of their assets. And those assets are basically millions of acres of drilling leases. Mm-hmm. And especially in the dry gas area, they need those drilling leases to be valuable so they can sell them at a profit. And that's what many of these companies are subsisting on. Companies like Chesapeake, that hasn't turned a profit on actual production of dry gas in any one of the last 10 years, but still remains a profitable company. How? By selling off drilling leases. But how do you maintain the value of those drilling leases? Through the fiction that there's 100 years worth of gas there, that you can drill anywhere and hit a bonanza. And that's what we decided to test with our Drill Baby Drill report that David Hughes authored at Post-Carbon Institute. We looked specifically at the assumptions that they're making, that the different plays are uniform among themselves, and also within plays, that in fact you can drill almost anywhere successfully. And we looked at almost 65,000 wells. We looked at the location of each well, the initial production rate, the rate at which they decline over time, and we found that those assumptions are not confirmed. That there are only small core areas within each of the plays that are initially significantly productive, and that production declines rapidly over time in almost all wells within the plays. So take all those things into account and you get a very, very different picture, not just from what the industry is telling us, but also from what the government is telling us. I mean, President Obama in his State of the Union address in January was touting shale gas and tight oil as, the energy saviors of America. And when you have it coming from the president himself, I mean, what more credibility could you possibly want? And yet it's all down to public relations. The assumptions are disconfirmed by the actual drilling data.
And there's a lot of, when you say government, I also think the state governments have really fallen down on the job. I think Texas does the best possible job of managing the situation. They've got really high quality people who know how to regulate the environment. I think they do a pretty good job with, given the number of holes they punch in the ground, the number of accidents that they do have with casing failures or water table disruptions statistically are low. Still very damaging to those that actually get impacted by them. And yet, despite that, all of that great sort of oversight, and with Texas taking the highest severance tax, which is a direct tax on actual production, out of any of the, Pennsylvania is not even getting remotely what Texas takes. Even with that, the Department of Transportation in Texas did this analysis and said fracking is doing about $4 billion of damage to our road surfaces and bridges on a yearly basis. These 80,000-pound trucks, of which it might take as many as almost 1,200 to complete a single well,
right.
600 if you want to refrack it. And those 1,200 trucks weighing 80,000 pounds filled with sand and water and fracking fluid and who knows what, and giant diesels and drilling rigs and stuff, that they're only collecting about $1 billion in severance tax back to repair the road damage, and they're doing $4 billion in damage. Who's going to pay that?
Right. Yeah. Well, this story is slowly starting to leak out to state and local officials. I say slowly because there's still a lot of public officials who have, are victims of the snow job of the industry, saying, this is going to be a bonanza for states in terms of not only tax revenues, severance taxes, but also in terms of jobs and therefore new state income tax revenues, and so on. But more and more analysis is showing that the jobs are fewer. They often go to out-of-state workers who are flown in to do the fracking jobs and well completions. That the costs to state and local governments are often greater than the revenues. And as this news comes in, more and more places are turning against fracking. Mm-hmm. It's really gotten its toehold here in the U.S., largely because of the subsurface mineral rights ownership regime in the U.S., which is different from almost everywhere else in the world, where property owners also own subsurface mineral rights, so they benefit directly financially from fracking operations. It's still dividing neighbor against neighbor, and it's still resulting in this boomtown frenzy that turns communities upside down. And more places are enacting laws or restrictions against fracking. Now, this is in the United States. Elsewhere in the world, where people don't own subsurface mineral rights and have no direct financial stake in oil or gas production, you can bet that the public outcry against this technology is going to be 10 times greater than the U.S. So when people talk about, we're just getting started and what we're going to do in the UK and Australia and China and so on, well, wait a minute. It's probably not going to go so well, both because of the things I was just talking about, also because the geology is different.
Right. And the regulatory environment, certainly in Europe, I won't speak as much about China, obviously, in this regard, but what a lot of people are concerned about fracking fluid in the water table, but I think they're missing the big part of the story for me. So as a former toxicologist, fracking fluid, 500 nasty chemicals in random combinations, toluene, benzene, xylene, you pick it, right?
Known cancer-causing chemicals.
Awesome stuff, right? The fracking operation, you pump all these millions of gallons of water plus however many gallons of this fracking fluid down, you pop it, and then it flows back and it goes into this big holding pit. And this is where I don't think Europe's going to lie down on this. When it goes into the holding pit, anything that wants to aerosolize or volatilize or otherwise drift away from that holding pit is free to do so. And lots of people downstream from these operations during the fracking operation report nausea, headaches, nosebleeds, all kinds of things that are very consistent with polyaromatic hydrocarbon toxicity. It's like clear as day. And the reason that the oil companies can do this is because of the so-called Halliburton Amendment. They are exempt from any Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act regulations around these chemicals. Yeah. So what's interesting is you could have literally hundreds of gallons of these things aerosolizing out of a fracking pit and going downstream. And right next door, you could have a dry cleaner that accidentally spills a liter of the same substance. Yeah. And boy, they would get in trouble, a huge amount of trouble. Because the EPA would regulate the bejesus out of that particular incident. There'd be hazmat teams and oil scrubbies. And it's just this dichotomy between what we allow in the name of oil production versus other ways we would regulate ourselves. The gap is just enormous in the U.S. I don't think that gap exists in Europe.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And it's going to be much, much more difficult for this. And you already see the public reaction in places like Romania and the UK. I mean, there are and some pretty gutsy citizen efforts to stand in the way of trucks and just prevent this from happening.
Well, I guess that's encouraging. Now, from my perspective, I think fracking it happened because it happened so fast and under the radar in the U.S. In fact, I started tracking what I thought was a very obvious PR campaign back in 2011. There were a number of articles, one in Reuters, one in the New York Times, one in the Washington Post, that all had very similar language that basically boiled down to, if the government and the environmentalists get out of the way, this is an awesome story, right? And there were flavors of that, like in each one of these pieces. And I said, wow, somebody's got a PR message which says, if we can just get the environmentalists out of our way, and if we can get the government regulators out of our way, shale oil and gas is going to be this awesome thing. It was a very, very brilliant campaign, golf class, right? It was nice. But people bought it, they ran with it, and it took years for sort of citizens with nosebleeds and nausea and dizziness and destroyed aquifers to say, time out on this. And so it took a while for this story to really begin to develop. And it is developing. But I want to get to this quote. Because I think this is the crux of the whole thing. It's a recent article from your newsletter found at your website, richardheinberg.com. And the quote is, "Today it is especially difficult for most people to understand our perilous global energy situation precisely because it has never been more important to do so." What do you mean?
Yeah, well, that's from an essay where I sort of take apart the politics of energy. Energy has never been more important. It's always been incredibly important because it's the basis of life. It's the basis of the economy. But it's even more important right now because we're faced with the requirement for an energy transition, both because of climate change and because of the depletion of the energy sources we've been relying on, all the things we've just been talking about. So we know we have to get off of fossil fuels, and this is going to be a huge job. It's going to require trillions of investment and decades of work and so on, but nothing's happening. Why? Because it's totally politicized. Climate change is completely politicized. On one hand, you have Democrats who say, "Oh, look at the science. It's clear this is an important thing. We got to do something about it. We don't know what, but we got to do something about it." And then the other political party says, "No, it's not happening. No, it's all just a conspiracy theory. There's no climate change." and if the weather's changing a little bit, it's not because of fossil fuels. It's cow farts or who knows? We don't know.
Yeah.
So as a result, nothing happens. Nothing happens with climate. Depletion is not acknowledged. All of the things we've been talking about with the problems of the oil majors and capex, none of that is talked about by politicians because it would actually require them to do something. So it's never been more important for the average person to understand energy issues than it is right now. But I don't think I doubt if there's ever been a time when energy issues have been so deliberately confused by the people who should be explaining them to us.
Well, I've certainly seen that. One piece that I have to fight constantly is this idea of energy independence, where they lump all the BTUs from coal, natural gas, oil, hydro, wind into one spot as if they're the same thing, and then say, "Oh, look, we're almost independent on this basis." It's a really bizarre way to do it, and it's very deliberately obfuscatory and confusing and unnecessarily so. I'm wondering in this quote, though, if there isn't a sense that it's difficult for people to talk about this precisely because it's just too large.
Yeah, well, I think that's true too. If you go very far into this and you really start following the evidence closely, it gets kind of overwhelming. Not just in terms of detail and and the requirement for some math and engineering knowledge and so on, but just in the sort of human toll of understanding that our entire way of life is really on shaky legs right now, and that we can't count on a future looking anything like what we have today, and that our children's future is likely to be very, very different and far poorer than our lives were. This is, psychologically, it's very difficult for a lot of people. I call this toxic knowledge. And my books are full of this toxic knowledge, and I always have a kind of mixed feelings about conveying this stuff, because I know I'm going to depress people. I'm going to cause them to go through some trying times personally, coming to terms with this information. And yet, is it better to know or not to know? Is it better to live in denial? Or to be aware of troubling truths? And when I think it through, I always come down on the latter side. It's better to know.
Well, yeah, I agree, and not doing anything is still doing something in this story.
That's true.
Right? There's no avoiding this. Sometimes I understand the human desire to avoid unpleasant information. If you've got that angry, irregular mole on the back of your leg, you can choose to ignore it or not. It's just, that's really where we're at in this story. It's like, maybe we don't want to have to face this, but here we are. And so I really think of this as just a monumental, colossal failure of leadership, if not imagination. I totally understand if you're an unimaginative politician, you look at this story and you say, I can't talk to people about self-imposed hardship and austerity. They're going to hate that, and they would.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the failure of imagination is, oh, by the way, we've done some really hard things in the past if we had the appropriate vision. Yeah. And that's what we're lacking, that vision that says, here's where we're going to go, and here's how we're going to get there. Hey, we have to fight some Nazis, so here's all the things you're going to have to do without as we go through this process. If conveyed properly, I think people will move mountains. Conveyed improperly, which is just, oh, by the way, we just want your energy to become more expensive until you start using less of it and all your jobs sort of fall away. I agree. Bad story. But what's really troubling for me in this story is when I talk to younger people, there's this extraordinary divide between my generation, the boomers, and younger people, say the millennials, and the poor Xers stuck in between. But the millennials have looked into this larger narrative and said, I don't get it. How does preserving the status quo help me at all?
Yeah.
Crumbling infrastructure, maybe an inappropriate infrastructure for the future I see coming, massive amounts of debt. I'm going to have to pay for your retirements with no guarantee that I'll get one out of this story. Right. And that's not really a compelling vision in there. Where's that vision going to come from?
Yeah. Well, frankly, for all the reasons I outlined in that essay that you quoted from, I think it's unlikely that it's going to come from the top anytime soon, absent some kind of major government restructuring, whether it comes in the form of a coup or revolution or what have you. Where I think it's got to come from is the bottom up, and that's, of course, that's terribly problematic, because there are lots of things you can't do from the bottom up. You can't institute a carbon tax from the bottom up. You can't reform agriculture as we know it nearly as quickly and efficiently from the bottom up as you could with just a few rule changes at the USDA. But nevertheless, that's what we got. And it is happening. I mean, I mentioned the USDA. The USDA points out in its recent literature that the segment of agriculture in the U.S. that's growing fastest is local food. The local food movement trumps everything else in current agriculture. So people are getting it at a certain level. Things are happening. It's kind of below the radar, and it's not going to be fast enough. It's not going to be enough of a change to avert the kinds of climate impacts that we're all concerned about and so on. But it's the leverage point we have. Operating locally, whether it's through the local grange or transition towns or just in your own backyard and with your own neighborhood, that's where we can make a difference, and a lot of people are already doing it.
In the absence of a compelling national narrative, people are arriving at their own. And by the way, it's very common. I go to all kinds of places. I see the same sets of responses and reactions in Louisville as I do in Sacramento, as I do in Austin. Still on a fairly small percentage basis, but really growing as the U.S.
I agree.
Very fast.
When I tell people I'm from California, they all go, "Oh, well, in California you have blah 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 blah. But, that must be so easy there." But when I travel around, I see basically the same thing happening everywhere. Whether it's Michigan or New York State or British Columbia, the local food movement is happening. Farmers markets are happening. People are, concerned about where energy is coming from and are doing what they can to put solar panels on their own houses and do what they can in their communities.
Well, with that, a gentleman I was talking to yesterday, I think, outlined it very well. He said he's done all those things. He said, I've got my solar panels, I've got my garden, I support local food. Very necessary, completely insufficient steps.
Absolutely.
There's this gap,
yeah.
And he feels uncomfortable with it. But you have to be the change you want to see. So what else can you do besides be that change? And at the same time, the sense that the things that we can't control are still very large and potentially overwhelming or swamp. They might swamp our efforts.
That's true.
And how do we begin to close that up? What can we possibly do?
Well, I think knitting together all of those local movements is really important. I think what you're doing with Peak Prosperity, what we try to do with Resilience.org, is helping people understand that they're not alone in this. That there are people everywhere who are fighting the same fight. Help them connect up first with the people in their local communities, but also with people, maybe on the other side of the planet who faced the same challenge and figured out a really good strategy for dealing with it. Beyond that, I wish I could say, well, let's start a new political party or something like that. But frankly, I don't. Right now, maybe it's just the mood I'm in, but I don't have much hope for that.
I applaud people who are trying to work from what I'll call the top down.
Mm-hmm. If somebody is working with a big organization like 350.org or Sierra Club or trying to infiltrate the Democratic Party and change its policies with regard to fracking or more power to you. If you can make some change at the top end, you have my total support. I don't want to be discouraging of that.
I'm in the same camp. I do think that this has to be local and ground up. And here's part of it. I mean, if you just let's take two steps back and we'll look at the big picture again and we'll say, let's imagine for the moment that all of a sudden world governments get religion around climate change. Yeah. And they really look at this, and obviously the big sources of carbon happen to all be from coal, oil, and natural gas. That's right. Most of it. So we get religion and we suddenly say, within 20 years, we have to be burning 75% less of these things. The implications of that are extraordinary. I mean, It literally means my lights might not come on when I flick the switches. It means that I will not be able to transport myself by putting fuel into my tank. It means everything suddenly changes. If there was an Apollo project and a Manhattan project, it would be both of those times some other large number, like 100. Yeah. In terms of the change we would have to go through to restructure ourselves in pretty much every way I can imagine. Plus, pour all of this investment into these alternative energies so that we have something we can do. If that happens, everything changes. But if we don't do that,
everything changes. Yeah, if we don't do that, then everything changes as a result of the economy coming apart, the debt bubble bursts, the agriculture declines because of the expense of oil and because of depletion of topsoil and because you can't trust the weather anymore, and we have we have a very dystopian future if we don't do anything. And whereas if we do what you were describing earlier, if we were to take all of these challenges seriously and put trillions of dollars into the energy transition and relocalize food systems and all the rest, it'd be the biggest thing we've ever done as a species, and it would be really hard. And all the things you're saying, yeah, we would probably find a lot of economic casualties along the way. But I think the end result would be a lot better.
It might also be exciting and fulfilling for people who are engaged in that.
We would have a huge project to devote ourselves to, and for young people, I think that's that it makes all the difference in the world. If you see the world around you basically going in the wrong direction and coming apart, that's one thing. But if you see a big challenge ahead that you can devote your life to, even if it's a challenge on the scale of World War II, it gave a lot of people, it gave their lives meaning.
Well, I agree. So here's I want to float an idea, because we talked about this gap between the millennials, the young people on the one hand, boomers on the other hand. Roughly speaking, millennials without a whole lot of assets because they're at that stage of their life. Boomers with a lot of assets. Now let's connect that. I have assets to this idea that we're kind of darned if we do, darned if we don't. Big change is coming.
Right.
And so the challenge I would like to promote is this idea that boomers, to the extent that they have assets and a sense of legacy potentially looming in front of them, really ought to be non-status quo, putting those assets to work while they still have utility, while you can still get traction. The big brown truck of happiness will still roll up your driveway after you click buy on Amazon, right, and give you awesome things, right?
But why not adopt a farmer?
But why not? Why not that? Why not? I'm too old to farm. I don't want to own one. I hear that a lot, and yet these are people who, some of them are sitting on quite sizable, still recognizable assets in the financial system. Yeah. The challenge is why not put those in a place, in a direction that feels good, makes sense today.
Yeah. And for the young farmers, and there are whole organizations of young farmers now. One of them that I follow closely is the Greenhorns, and they're doing great work. And these are young people who are totally dedicated to farming in an ecological, truly sustainable way. And almost universally, the one thing they lack is access to land. And if they get access to land, it's usually on the basis of land rental. So, okay, supposing you're a wealthy baby boomer and you want to adopt a farmer, under what conditions is that actually a fair relationship? That's I don't know that there's anybody's totally worked out the answer to that question, but it's a question that needs to be addressed. Because if this turns out to be just a new form of serfdom, where, there are a lot of young millennials around who are capable of working hard, and you can teach them how to farm. Okay, let's put them to work for us. There's something wrong with that picture. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, the people who do the work need to end up owning the land. I don't know. Again, I don't know how that looks legally.
Right.
But these young people need a sense of an end game in this.
Well, sweat equity is real equity, and this idea that paper money is the be-all, end-all. That's sort of our cultural narrative, right? If you have that form of capital, you have it all. Right. And we haven't traditionally rewarded sweat equity. And in fact, the trends in labor are not good over the past decade and a half. So we're even devaluing the human inputs more, and robotics, we'll just do this. It'll all be about capital. So you're right. We have to find a way to make this equitable. And here's that gap between the younger and the older generations. The older generations have everything to lose if the status quo isn't maintained, right? And to be fair, they've paid into the system, they've worked hard, played by the rules, and had this expectation of retirement, all within the parameters of the system. But now we get to this new part of the story where we say, we've overpromised, right? Yeah. And we know this, right? The entitlement programs, 100 trillion underfunded, and basic pensions everywhere underfunded, and unlikely that that's ever going to sort of recover. And so there has to be this sense of releasing of expectations, releasing of what we thought we were promised on one end of the generational scale, and finding a way to make it fair for the people on the other end, because this is ultimately turning into a story that's not fair. And by nobody's fault. Can I say not fair without blaming?
Yeah.
And so it's that there is a fairness gap there. And I talk to young people, and they look square at it, and they go, yeah, I'm not participating in that.
Yeah.
That doesn't look right at all. And so here's an example of that. I know a guy in his 30s, lives in my county. I happen to live in one of the poorer counties in Massachusetts on a per capita income basis. Very intelligent, working 3 jobs, really intelligently, still has to make use of food stamps, right? This is who he is. He's pieced this life together out of what's available in as hardworking and as diligently as anybody I could imagine. Probably better than I was doing at that age, for sure. Yeah. But I grew up at a different time, right? And so I look at that and I say, that's really fundamentally not fair, particularly when you have people on the other end who are sitting on relatively largest sized asset bases at this point, but they're desperately afraid of losing it. This guy on this end has nothing. These people are desperately afraid of losing it. We got to close that gap.
That's right. Yeah, one way or another, we have to address the problem of wealth inequality in this country. Otherwise, it's already tearing us apart, but it's going to do so, much more savagely as time goes on. This is what creates revolutions. I mean, look back historically. If the wealth disparity gets just too extreme, and we're back in Gilded Age levels of wealth disparity right now, and so how do you address that? Well, it's through different banking rules, through all different possibilities. In my book, The End of Growth, I suggested the possibility of haircuts for everyone. Just chop a 0 off the end of all debts and assets. That's I don't know how likely that is, but we're going to have to do something like that.
Well, it's encouraging that we see this at the local level. I agree that I don't see much yet at the national level to give me hope. Worse, let me be honest. I think we're further away from what I would call a rational discussion in D.C., not closer. Yeah. Over the 10 years I've sort of been engaged in this project of awareness.
Yeah.
And so
that's a sad commentary.
It is a sad commentary. I have a little personal fault in that. I'm like, really? I must have failed at what I've done. I have a little of that lurking in there, and yet it also confirms for me this idea that we have to prepare for a very different future because there are no preparations being undertaken that I'm aware of.
Right.
If they're doing it, it's a skunkworks project.
Well, the only preparations we see are, frankly, the militarization of police forces around the country and the ubiquitous surveillance. So that's not very confidence building in terms of our future.
It is a set of responses that does make sense, and I could actually, if I step into that role, I could understand why people would make those decisions.
Yeah, well, they see that more social unrest is likely as a result of the current trends. So they're preparing for social unrest rather than addressing the trends.
Right. So with that, I see we're out of time on this wonderful interview. Thank you so much for your time today.
I'm sorry we had to end on kind of a down note.
Well, then that's not.
I think there was a lot of there was a lot of content in there that I think folks can draw encouragement from. So I'm willing to let it go at that. But it has been a pleasure talking with you, Chris.
Well, thanks. The pleasure's been mine. And people can find out more at your website, richardheinberg.com. And any events coming up or anything people should know about?
Oh, gosh. My calendar is on the website, and I don't look at it often enough. I don't even know what I'm doing half the time.
I understand that model.
More than a week ahead.
Well, fantastic. Because I totally understand how that works. So glad to hear you're busy and going to be out there helping to share this message. Because the summary I have is it's not about preparing for the apocalypse. It's simply understanding and becoming emotionally accepting of the fact that these changes are coming.
Right.
And if you choose to, the warning signs are all there.
And there are lots of things that we can do ourselves and with our friends and neighbors and relatives. And the more we do, the better we feel.
So really, I see this as an invitation to get busy.
Yep.
And the invitation is now printed in 48-point Helvetica font and being hand delivered.
And scrolling across the screen.
And there it is in the news every day, and it's for anybody to see. So again, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Chris.